As I mentioned, we're going to be discussing in this panel the geopolitical state of affairs. And I will deliver a brief introduction here of our guests. So you know who we were discussing with. Dominik Mutter is the Security Policy Director at the German Federal Foreign Office. We also have Ms. Barbara Beltrame with us. She is the Vice President for International Affairs of Confindustria. We have Mr. Geoffroy Roux de Bézu, the President of MEDEF International. Ichiro Hara is with us as well, the Managing Director of Keidanren. And of course, Perrin Beatty, who I just mentioned, is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Good morning to you. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to start with you, Mr. B, for the first question. In the war in Ukraine that we have been discussing is not so far from the stage that we're standing on here in Berlin. What is the perspective in Canada? What role does the war play there?
Let me give a bit of perspective on that. I think, as many of you know, I'm a former defense minister and foreign minister in Canada. During the time that I was there, it was the time of glasnost, of the wall coming down here in Berlin, and of the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. We saw literally hundreds of millions of people moving from dictatorship to freedom. And there was an optimism that developed in the world, and a belief that internationalism and that democracy were on the march and could never be turned back. What we've learned over the course of the intervening years, and particularly this year, is that nothing can be taken for granted. That democracy and freedom are not, it's not a mortgage that you pay off once and for all, but it's something that, it's like a garden that you have to tend on a continuing basis. In Canada, because of our geography, we have believed that we lived in a fireproof house. Because of our success in living in peace and democracy, it was like being born, for people in my generation, being born in an orchard, where you hold out your hand and an apple falls into it. And you assume that that's your birthright. It will always be that way. What has happened in Ukraine demonstrates to us the fragility of freedom. It demonstrates to us the importance of our being willing to invest, both in terms of the politics and in terms of the security, to ensure that freedom exists. And it underlines to us that the industrialized democracies who have a common interest and whose citizens are united by common values have to work together. One final comment I would make on it as well is that it's not just the external threat that we face as Western democracies, as industrialized democracies, it is also internal in many of our countries as well. And we have to be on our guard to ensure that these values are protected. So we need to do it together. None of us is strong enough to do it by ourselves.
Thank you for that answer. The realization of that fragility, perhaps, certainly we can allow applause for that. Mr. Roux de Bézu, if I could follow up on that. The realization of that fragility has led the German Chancellor here, Olaf Scholz, as we heard Professor Husrum say, declared that this is a Zeitenwende. So basically, this is a sea change, a turning point for Germany, but also for the entirety of the European Union. Do you think that this is also a turning point for global economic relations?
Hello, everybody. I guess the turning point took place a few years before. I think the war in Ukraine is obviously a crystallization of that turning point, and it's very visible for us. It's in all our media. But in fact, I think it started 5 or 10 years ago, basically back in the early 90s when we decided collectively to get China into the WTO. We all believed at the time that globalization, the effect of business will lead everybody to become a democracy. It was the time where Francis Fukuyama wrote that book, The End of History. But unfortunately, for the good and the bad, history got caught up. And we know that since 5-10 years, China had decided to change the way they want to do business. They want to rebalance the world to their profits. And the war in Ukraine is just the last manifestation of that change of the order of the world. So as Siegfried pointed out, we should not throw away globalization. It had a lot of good things. It pulled out millions and millions of people out of poverty, especially in emerging countries, and we should not forget that. But it has led a lot of people outside the road, in those countries as well, but also in our countries. Let me just say a few words on the French election last night, which unfortunately I think is not good news. What we will call the camp of the reasonable people, of the rational people, has lost, in fact. And the simplistic solution within democracy are also gaining ground and getting a stronger voice. So I think our common objective should be to be able to convince people that the liberty, the freedom, is the best solution for prosperity. And certainly, with that in mind, we have to correct a few things in the way we do business today.
I'll come back to that point of a rethink that started a few years ago, even before the war in Ukraine. But Mr. Mutta, I want to come to you and talk about the immediate crises on hand. According to the UNHCR, more than 6.6 million refugees have fled Ukraine as of the end of May. We're also seeing a massive food insecurity crisis, as many of you will know as well. So many developing countries depend on Russia and Ukraine for wheat and for barley. From the German government's perspective, how dire are these crises?
Well, it's very dire, and that's why we've made it a focus of our G7 presidency. When the foreign ministers met in May, it was one of their main focus points. We're going to have a conference of the foreign ministers, the development aid ministers, and the agricultural ministers this Friday here in Berlin of the G7 partners, but also of the vulnerable countries and other partners that can contribute to finding ways to alleviate this crisis. The World Food Programme estimates that more than 320 million people are directly affected by it as of now, and that will only worsen probably. It's important because there are also alternative narratives out there to make sure we know who is responsible for this crisis. And that is not only, but certainly, especially the war in Ukraine. We've had rising food prices before. Wheat has gone up by 80% over the course of 1 year. But since February 24th, it has gone up by 35%. So the war has certainly aggravated an already dire situation, and it is clear who is responsible for that war, and that is Russia.
That is certainly the case. And Ms. Beltrame, if I can come to you, I want to ask you about the fact that the 12th Ministerial Conference concluded with multilateral outcomes in e-commerce, trade, health, fishery subsidies. But there is still a long way to go, and I can see from the look on your face that you would seem to agree with that. What does the war in Ukraine mean for the rules-based order?
Okay, so first, thank you very much. And I would like first to congratulate with BDI for have organized this event, this summit in this very difficult situation that we are covered. Yes, the Ministerial Conference, the WTO. I think that even before the war, the function of the WTO was very critical. I mean, as we know, they deliver a package that does not cover the business needs. That is very difficult for us. But I think that is not the problem of WTO, because WTO is a driving organization. But the responsibility, I think, is from the governments. And as we know also that the power of the Director General is very limited in this moment. And I know her. I think she is very competent, competent and commitment. And I'm sure that without her, the conference was, if she was not there, was not so good. I want to say that. But all in all, there are a very encouraging signal, but a lot remains to be done. And I think that business need more than this to navigate the global market. So we believe that the trade and investment are powerful drivers of growth, inclusion, and sustainable development, of course. However, also, we think that we know that there are some benefits only if an efficient rule-based and multilateral government is in place. But now the time is very ticking, so we need to move as fast. Trade and investment are more and more used as a battlefield, and the WTO now is still seeking its way out from a long, long crisis. Just one thing, so I hope that the G7 will build the strong consequences, strong consensus on the reform plan, and we reach out to the most influenced member of the G20 in view of the 2023 Ministerial Conference.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that answer. Mr. Hara, I'd like to come to you now. We've talked about the rules-based order. We've talked about the food insecurity crisis, also refugee crisis. I'd like to get your perspective on how this is all viewed in Japan, because there's been something of a Zeitenwende there as well with the shipment of heavy arms to Ukraine in this conflict. So what is your perspective on the conflict there in Japan?
Thank you. The war in Ukraine could be a turning point for Japan as well. Heaven helps those who helps themselves. That is one of the lessons we are learning from the Ukraine. And taking this opportunity, as only a panelist from Asia, I'd like to draw your attention to the military balance in East Asia. In 2000, Japan's defense spending accounts for the 38% of against the total. And China, 36%, and Taiwan, 15%, and Korea, 11%. After 20 years, the picture is totally different. Now, in 2020, China accounts for 65%, Japan, only 70%, and Korea, 13%, Taiwan, 5%. So as Japan has maintained its defense spending at a level of 1% of GDP, a Chinese military capability becomes more than 4 times as big as Japan's. I'll stop here.
Well, maybe I can just follow up on that question then, because the numbers that you mentioned are important, and the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, has warned that this war could be replicated in East Asia, saying Ukraine may be East Asia tomorrow. How deeply, Mr. Hara, is that threat perceived in Japan?
Thank you for the question. In April this year, one of the ruling parties in Japan, Liberal Democratic Party, came up with recommendation to the government that Japan's defense spending should be increased to the equivalent of 2% within 5 years. According to the questionnaire survey conducted by the Japan Economic Journal in May, more than half of the respondents support the increase of defense spending. This is a significant change compared with the past. The target figure is also included in the ruling Liberal Democratic Party's manifesto for the upper house election to be held on July 10th. So soon we will see the choice made by the people, Japanese people.
That's an interesting point, of course. The support for more defense spending might tell us a lot about how people feel about that perceived threat. That's something we've seen here in Germany as well. Mr. Beatty, if I can come back to you for this question on the rapid growth that we've seen from China and the dominance we've seen from China in the global economy in the past few years, and of course over the past decade in particular. But we heard from Mr. Rosfram that decoupling is not the way forward. How do you see these discussions about dependency and decoupling? How realistic are these discussions?
I think it was covered very well in the opening address. We can't disengage. We have to continue to work with one another. But I don't think we should be naive about what we're dealing with, any more with China than we were in the case of Russia. Many of us in this room made the argument in favor of China being admitted to the WTO on the grounds that bringing them into the international family would cause them to comply with the international way of doing things and with the rule of law. And we believed that through engagement, through commerce, and through diplomatic and other interactions, that China would inevitably morph into something that was more democratic as well, that somehow they would become us. We have to accept that there are many people in the world who want what we have, but who don't want to be us. And as a consequence, then, I think we need to recognize that we are engaged in a competition with China. which is deep-seated and long-standing, which is not going to be over anytime soon, and that will require a persistence and a clear vision on the part of the industrialized democracies again, just as I was saying earlier with regard to Russia. The temptation is there post-COVID, post all of the problems that we have had with supply chains, post the experience that we had in Canada with China engaging in hostage diplomacy, seizing 2 Canadians and holding them hostage. The temptation is to disengage, to pull back, and in many instances to attempt to onshore production and do everything at home. This would be very foolish. You cannot do that. And as was pointed out in the opening address, the issue when it comes to business is ensuring security of supply. It's security, not nationalizing everything. And it is critical for us to ensure security of supply at the lowest possible price. We would simply price our businesses out of business. We would be uncompetitive if we attempted to do everything at home. So again, the West needs to have an engaging China, needs to have a coherent, not just the West, the industrialized democracies need to have a coherent plan that we don't have today. We should not be doing it on the basis of one-offs, because none of us is strong enough or big enough to do that. And we need to develop that strategy now, and we have to demonstrate that democracies have the strength of will to be able to continue a struggle over the course of decades or perhaps even lifetimes because of the values that we believe in. We can do that without turning the Chinese into enemies. The final comment I would make is that often people say to me, well, what will happen if China succeeds? The question I put to them is, what would happen if China failed? If China descended into civil war? Would we be better off as a result? No. So we need to engage, but we need to do so with clear eyes and with a clear strategy.
Mr. Mutter, if I can directly follow up on that with you, because the policy that Mr. Beatty was just describing there is one that has been practiced by the German government for some time. This concept that you can change democratic values or export them through business, through commerce, through partnerships. Is that a model that you think has failed?
Well, I mean, maybe it's always been a bit optimistic, this model. And maybe it's been more driven by how nice it sounds in German. Really actual evidence for it. I mean, it's worth remembering that the first phase of globalization was the one leading up to World War I, where the world was as integrated as it hadn't been before, and yet we had this catastrophic war. So it would be naive to say that as long as we're all trading nicely together, everything is going to be fine. But the alternative cannot be to withdraw behind our own borders, and as has been pointed out very eloquently and also by Professor Rosenworm, that would be against our own interests and against our security interests as well. If a country closes itself off, it will fall behind. So the alternative must be to stay committed to open markets, while at the same time diversifying, creating better resilience within our countries, and enhancing ties with liberal democracies that also share our values, and where we then can reap even more benefits through free trade.
Okay, well, there's certainly consensus on this stage on that point. Mr. Rudevizier, if I can come back to you now and talk about the role that industry can play in all of this. Germany's G7 presidency program professes, and I'll quote, a resolute commitment to open societies and human rights, as well as the defense of liberal democracies that forms the base of our actions. What role does and can the private sector play in that?
When I was a student, long time ago, in the 20th century, there was a book that was read by a lot of students called Capitalism and Democracy by Milton Friedman. And basically the thesis of that book is that both goes together, the freedom of entrepreneurship and the freedom of politics have to go together. The more freedom you give to the people, the more entrepreneurship there is, the more prosperity there is for everybody. And I think we have to go back to that. I think we are in a competition between models. We have the democracy, the Western democracy, which have a model, and then the rest of the world seems to have another model. And we have to convince our fellow citizens inside our democracy, but also outside, that our model is better because we create more wealth and more prosperity, and we share it more. So that starts in our own country, and every one of us has to be as entrepreneur as possible to make sure that we create more wealth for our citizens, all our citizens. And the question of inclusion, the question of sharing the profit is clearly a question for us. And then outside, I was discussing with the Ministry of Economy of Senegal, Mr. Hott, a few minutes before, and he was mentioning he has election in a few months, I believe. Democracy outside the Western world is very fragile. We know that actually it has lost ground in the last years. So we have to make sure that those countries which are democratic outside Europe, the US, Japan, Korea, are prosperous, are developing faster than the countries which are not respecting those values. I agree with you, Mr. Beatty, we should not disengage, but maybe we should engage more with the countries that respect our values than the others.
Okay, so building deeper partnerships with like-minded democracies, let's say. Ms. Beltrame, if I can come back to you now, something we've talked about quite a bit already is supply chains and the importance of how to make more resilient supply chains. What is your perspective on that? How can politics and business also together make supply chains more resilient?
Yes, as you said, actually the public opinion of a debate about resilience, but I think we should make very clear that the larger part of the job have done and has been done by business shoulders. So actually that is for sure. So companies, as we know, have suffered a lot and still struggle with the logistic bottlenecks, technical barriers, regulatory divergency, and so on. And business can do a lot of its own, but not everything, otherwise it will be very difficult. So government and international governments should do more, and is the viability and security of a supply chain. But another thing that I think is very important, that I do not believe that the G7 business need any how we say, top-down new business model, because I think in this moment all the world are interconnected. Companies must be free to trade and invest where they want. So, because actually they have all own strategy, of course. And the solution, good for all, there is no solution, I think. But anyway, the value-based partnership are for exploring a development. But if they are reinforcing the relocation of key supply chain, well, I think they would go too far. Overall, I would recommend also to the G7 to improve their collective effort to secure a business-friendly strategy, because a regulatory system, of course, because the G7 countries need to work together for a new economy and for a mutual-based trust. And I think business are here for that, and all of us want to work with them.
Okay, so that's part of the wish list to governments of the G7 countries that you would send along. Mr. Hara, if I could come to you now, another thing that has been upended by this conflict is global energy supplies, of course, as well. How has that affected Japan's economic outlook and also its relationship with G7 countries?
Thank you for your question. Japan's primary energy supply composition is like this. Coal 25%, oil 36%, and gas 24%. While Japan's self-sufficient rate of energy is very low, around 11%, it has been in full alignment with other G7 countries in banning coal and oil imports from Russia. And it is urgent for Japan to diversify sources of energy supply, including LNG, and to develop supply chains of hydrogen and ammonia. In doing so, it is indispensable to enhance the relations with Middle East, African countries, the Central and South Americas, as well as G7 like-minded countries such as the G7 members. Keidanren, Japan Business Federation, calls upon the government to conclude free trade agreements and other economic treaties. On the domestic side, I'd like to emphasize the importance of restarting nuclear power plants. Now only 4 plants are in operation. Before the accident of Fukushima nuclear power plant in 2011, more than 50 plants were in operation. Thank you very much.
We see nodding from Mr. Rudebezu. Of course, that's France's position as well on energy. We'll be actually talking about energy supply, hydrogen, LNG, all of that diversifying energy supply in the next panel in about 15 minutes from now. So that's just a teaser for what's to come. Mr. Beatty, if I could come back to you now with the question, what possibilities remain for the G7? How do you think the G7 should move forward in pursuing its partnerships and its interests?
Well, I think more than anything else, the leaders of the G7 have to understand that we're more interdependent than ever before, that none of us can go it alone. And the odd thing, I think the great struggle that we see today, the ideological struggle, if you like, is not between left and right. It's between open and closed societies. And we represent open societies, ones that want to engage with the rest of the world and ones that believe in liberal democratic values. And that means that we share in common, whether it's in our business strategies and our commitment to free enterprise or in our social and political values, we share a great deal in common. We need to look at ways of deepening our relationship with one another and of looking for global solutions on the key issues that we're dealing with, that we're preoccupied with. Global security. The operative word there is global. Global pandemics. The operative word there is global. The global financial crises. The operative word is global. We can't solve these problems alone. We have to have a common strategy. The world today is much more complex. It's much more multipolar than it was during the time when I was in government. When the B7 got together when I was in government, it was Chancellor Kohl, it was François Mitterrand, it was Brian Mulroney from Canada, President Reagan, Mrs. Thatcher. And there was a sense that when our leaders got together, problems would be solved. Now, unfortunately, because of the changes in the nature of our politics and of global society, it seems often that the problems are larger than the leaders. And it's going to be critical then for those of us, particularly in the business community, to provide leadership and to make the argument that both in the protection of our values and in the protection of our economic strength, we need to collaborate much more closely and to develop clear, well-communicated, sustained plans. Global plans, indeed. Mr. Mutter, if I could come to you now, one of the aspects that we've seen with this Zeitenwende here in Germany is that there's been a lot of pressure for Germany to do more in terms of its defense spending. And what we saw Chancellor Scholz announce was 100 billion euros to strengthen defense capacity. But we've seen some mixed messaging on whether that will actually be enough, whether Germany can meet its commitment to NATO as well. So where does Germany stand in shouldering some of that responsibility going forward?
So thank you for that question, which allows me to clarify a few things. So Germany is committed to the 2%. It has been since 2014, even though sometimes that was a bit more in theory than in practice. But it remains committed to the 2%, and it will meet the 2% over the course of the next 5 years on average. Now, why on average? Because some of these big-ticket items that we're going to buy, the F-35 and others, you can't just procure them overnight. So it will probably be a bit of an uneven graph over the next 5 years, but we will meet the 2% on average for the next 5 years. And we do so not just, and that's one of the problems we have with the 2%, it's an input-driven goal, when it should be really more on output. And output should be capabilities. So we need to increase our capabilities in order to be better allies in NATO, in order to be more responsible for our allies and partners. And for that, we will increase our capabilities. And that should drive our defense spending and will drive it. However, the other thing about the Zeitenwende, and even in the speech, the Chancellor alluded to that, is of course it has to go much deeper. And for it to be a real shift, it needs to happen in the minds of policymakers, but also in the minds of the German people. And that will take time. And so that's why Germany, for the first time, is drafting a national security strategy, which will lay out our national security strategy and engage with the population on it in order to help make that shift in the minds of people also happen.
That's an important point. It's not just about the perspective of the government, but rather also the people, as we've heard on this panel already. Mr. Rüdebezoe, are there many areas beyond those that are already areas of cooperation for the G7 that you think could come together for closer cooperation going forward, where they could work together, these countries, more deeply?
Certainly. Before I answer your question, just make a small comment on the previous speaker. The French are very happy to see the German spending more on their defense, because we've been spending for years 2% of our GDP, a little bit alone in Europe. So we're very pleased, but we hope that this will be done through cooperation, industrial cooperation through Europe. Otherwise, I think it will be a waste to afford. In terms of G7 cooperation, yes, I think we can do more. Certainly, we should include other countries in terms of cooperation. I think I mentioned Senegal earlier, because we, the 7 countries, share values, but I'm sure there are other countries in the world who share those values, which will be helped, supported, included in our cooperation. And the obvious cooperation is on 2 subjects. I think energy, that was mentioned by my Japanese neighbor, and also I believe health, which has become a major problem, and we should cooperate probably more than we've done in the past year on those subjects. There will be more pandemics in the coming years. We all know that. So yes, closer cooperation in G7 is needed.
And Ms. Beltrame, you said just a little while ago, we don't need a top-down business model. Does the G7 need a new business model? If so, what should that look like?
Actually, I think that our business need to do what the strategy business do it. So if we do a new model, I think it's enough for what we have, actually, because our business are very good in what they're doing. So why changing the new model? I mean, there is no answer at that, and I think it's okay like this, we think.
So the business model is okay as it is. Okay, don't touch it is the message from the B7 principles here. And perhaps a final question to you, Mr. Beatty, before we wrap up this panel discussion, as we're running a little bit to the end of our time here. Do you think that these crises that the world is facing at the moment, but particularly the G7 is facing at the moment, that it can strengthen this cooperation and this collection of countries?
My answer is, I hope so. The problem is that what we've seen, whether it's in pandemic planning or providing for global security or dealing with climate change, we don't learn from history. And my hope is that we'll look at the circumstances in which we find ourselves today and recognize that none of us is strong enough to go it alone, that we're all stronger by coming together, and that even if any of us was strong enough, if any of us were strong enough to go it alone, my experience has always been that when you collaborate with others, you get a much better result than you would have by attempting to do it by yourself. I hope that's the lesson that our leaders learn, and that they recognize that we're stronger together.
I think that's a very fitting message to end this panel discussion on. I hope you agree. Thank you very much for that interesting discussion, and you are welcome to take your seats again. Thank you.